In this lesson, we'll wrap up our first simple shader and put it to use finally. Let's make an interactive script that will let us hover the mouse over a game object, like our example safety hat, and then swap to its highlighted counterpart. This will be a fun addition to any 3D user interface, adding some emphasis to your mouse pointer by making the object pop off the background with a glow. Here's the current state of our highlight shader graph. You may want to make the texture 2D asset a property to expose it in the inspector. That will make it easier for you to use this shader with other objects, of course. Just select this node and let's right-click, convert to property, and let's call the property base texture. If you want to clean up any extra nodes or properties that aren't being used, you can do that now or just leave them. It doesn't really hurt anything that they're there. What we want to do is toggle a specific mesh renderer between its normal material and its highlighted material. By default, we want the object to look like its natural state. When the time is right, we want it to show up in its highlighted state. There are a few ways of doing this, and we're going to just keep this deliberately simple. What I'm going to do is set up two different game objects, one that has the normal material and another that has the highlighted material. We'll just disable the highlighted mesh renderer by default, and then we'll only enable it when the mouse button touches the game object. Let's switch the safety hat's material back to hard hat matte material. We'll also need a MeshHighlighter so we can detect the mouse pointer. Add component, physics, MeshHighlighter. And that should get populated with the safety hat low model by default. Unity's smart enough to do that. Our logic is going to be performed by a script, so let's make a new C# script called MeshHighlighter. Create C# script, MeshHighlighter. And even though it doesn't do anything yet, we can attach this to the safety hat object. And let's make another instance of the safety hat with the highlighted material. Select the safety hat, right-click, duplicate, and let's just rename this to safety hat highlight. On this second instance of the hat, we should remove the MeshHighlighter and the MeshHighlighter script. Sorry, we probably should have duplicated the object before we added those. And then let's change the single material in the mesh renderer to hard hat highlight matte material. We can parent this version of the safety hat onto the original game object just for safekeeping. Now there will be some z-fighting since we have two exact meshes on top of one another. And I recommend that you disable the mesh renderer of the highlighted hard hat and then only enable the mesh renderer of the original game object. Eventually, our script will just toggle these components on or off as needed. And let's edit our MeshHighlighter component. We didn't want to make this a scripting course, so if you don't want to type this out, feel free to just grab the finished MeshHighlighter script from the resources and then just replace this blank version. But it's super short, and even if you aren't super confident with your scripting, this should be relatively painless to follow along. We want to apply the script to our game object with a mesh renderer. So let's enforce that with a require component attribute at the top. Require component, type of mesh renderer. Let's define a couple of fields to reference our mesh renderers. Now one mesh renderer will just be private, so let's call that mesh renderer original mesh. The other mesh renderer I do want to expose in the inspector. Let's tag that with a serialize field attribute. This can still be private, and we'll call that highlighted mesh. This one we need to populate in the inspector, hence the serialize field attribute. In our start method, let's just get a reference to the original mesh. Original mesh equals get component mesh renderer. And now let's make a simple method to enable and disable the meshes. I'll call it enable highlight. Public void enable highlight. Let's pass in a boolean on off. This will determine the state of whether the highlight is active or not. We only want this logic to run if we've populated our highlighted mesh in the inspector. So let's add a little guard in here if highlighted mesh is not equal to null. And then inside, let's switch our enabled property of the mesh renderer based on what state we pass in as an argument. Highlighted mesh dot enabled equals our on or off state, and original mesh dot enabled equals not our on or off state. When we want the highlight, we disable the original mesh and enable the glowing mesh, and vice versa. To toggle the highlight on or off, we just want to take advantage of MonoBehavior's on-mouse enter and on-mouse exit built-in methods. Remember that we added a MeshHighlighter component to the GameObject. So if I define a private void on-mouse enter method, this will invoke when my mouse pointer touches the MeshHighlighter for the first time, and we can simply add a enable highlight true inside of here. And then by the same token, we also can define a private void on mouse exit when the mouse pointer leaves the GameObject. Inside we just add enable highlight false. So this means that the first time that we mouse around and touch the MeshHighlighter, the script will enable the highlighted hard hat, and then it's going to disable the original hard hat. And then once you drag the mouse pointer outside of the GameObject, the script will disable the highlighted mesh renderer and then enable a normal one. And there's one more thing I probably want to add, and that's to make sure that the highlight is off by default. In our start method, let's plug in an extra enable highlight false somewhere in here. And really that's all we need to do as far as the highlight logic goes. This is super simple, so that's why I went with this approach. It is less efficient because we do have an extra mesh renderer component and an extra GameObject, but it keeps the scripted logic relatively easy. Now, if I had to do several hundred objects like this, I probably would create a structure that would map one set of materials to another and then just swap them out at runtime. But it's probably unnecessary for a handful of GameObjects in our sample scene. Save the script and let's go back to the editor. Find the safety hat object. In the highlighted mesh field, just drag in the safety hat highlight GameObject and save your scene. And that should do it. We should have our MeshHighlighter functional, at least for the safety hat. So enter play mode, hover your mouse over the safety hat, and look at that. Our mesh glows using the highlight shader. Okay, terrific. This is one application of our shader graph. Imagine you can do all sorts of stuff with this little glow shader if you wanted to call attention to your GameObject at runtime. If you had a special pickup object or part of the screen that you wanted to call attention to, you could just add a glow shader there and then draw your viewer to that part of the screen. Now, how you want to use this is really up to you. For your challenge, you might want to try to practice setting up more GameObjects like our safety hat. And note that you'll need to create a new material for each GameObject that you want to highlight. Really, any material that needs a highlighted version, you'll need to make a duplicate material. And you also need to make a duplicate proxy object that's going to hold all of the highlighted materials on a separate mesh renderer. Now, once you do that, you just add a MeshHighlighter script to the original object and then assign the highlighted mesh renderer to the empty field. After you set that up, your object will highlight whenever you mouse over it. Okay, pretty cool. Set up as many GameObjects in the sample scene as you want with this effect. Go ahead and pause the video and continue to the end of the lecture when you're ready. Well, there it is. We won't go through all the steps for setting up the other GameObjects, but here's my example scene showing a bunch of the various props, the jigsaw, the hammer, the 5-gallon bucket, and various other parts of the room highlight when my mouse crawls over them. And note that I had to set up a lot of extra materials for each highlighted object. Some objects have more than one material, so they need to have more than one highlighted material. We have a duplicate little proxy for each highlighted GameObject. And the original GameObjects have a MeshHighlighter component and a MeshHighlighter script. Okay, well, that takes us through the basics of creating a shader graph and demoing one specific application of this shader. In the next lesson, let's look at how we can expand the shader graph a little bit more, and we can add more than one texture and create a small reusable set of nodes called a subgraph.